Hi everyone. Lesson, we are going to take a look at how we're going to create a print-in-place design. We can see that this design has some concentric rings, and they have some pins that pierce through to the other side of the ring, and they're going to be used to rotate the central cylinder and the other two rings separate from each other. However, we're not going to put this together afterwards. We're going to build it so that it prints flat and is already ready once you peel it off of the build plate to start spinning. So let's head over to Tinkercad and take a look at how we can make a print-in-place rotating design. We are going to put together this simple spinner. Of course, we're going to build it lying flat. Let's move our example out of the way here. Take a look at the shapes that we're actually going to need here. There's going to be 3 pieces that can rotate independently, and they're going to require some pins and holes for those pins so that it can spin. So let's start with our central cylinder. I'm going to bring out a new cylinder here. I'm going to make the entire thing 5 millimeters tall. And we're going to make this 30 millimeters across. And lastly, I want to increase the number of sides so that the cylinder looks nice and smooth. And next, I am going to need some tubes to go around the outside with enough space in between them. So let's scroll down here to our tube shape. Now we could use cylinders with other cylinder holes to cut out the center, but the tube already has the hole in the center with a wall thickness that I can control. So we're going to use the numbers here. I'm going to change my wall thickness and make it 2 millimeters. So I know that on either side of this cylinder, the walls are 2 millimeters thick. And since this is 30, I want my radius, well, if I make my radius 15, it's going to match this circle. So I'm going to need we'll put 1.5 millimeters in between these walls. So I'm going to need 15 for this, plus 1.5, plus 2 for the thickness of the wall. So we're going to make this 18.5. And just like our cylinder, we're going to increase the number of sides so that it looks smoother. And let's see if we got our numbers right. I'm going to select both of my objects here. I'm going to go up to the Align tool, and we're going to push the center selection in both directions here, and look at it from the top. Now it can be hard to tell exactly how much a gap is with the perspective mode, so we can go over here and turn on flat or orthographic view, and select the top on our view cube. So we're looking straight down from the top, and we are losing any kind of perspective, so we can tell exactly how things are lined up. And that's looking good. Of course, when we look at it from the side, I can see once again that this is still too tall. So we need to select our tube here and change the height to 5 so that it matches the middle part of our spinner. Next, I'm going to need another tube, so I'm going to go ahead and just duplicate this one in place. So when you hit duplicate and repeat, it's going to make a copy that is sitting in the exact same spot as the original. And now I can increase the radius so that we add another 2 millimeters for the wall thickness and another 1.5 for the gap that we want. So we're going to go to 22. And we're going to end up with the same exact gap on both sides. Now we have our concentric circles. I could keep on going, adding these numbers and having additional circles. And if we went through and made them all with pins, we could eventually make them all spin. But I'm going to keep this to 2. I want a small pocket-sized device. Now that we have our rings, we're going to need the pins themselves. And for that, we're going to use a cone. Now, starting with a cone, we can tell it's not facing in the right direction, but I have a top and base radius. So I can make the top, rather than a point, I can make it 0.5 so that it has a 1 millimeter radius at the top. And we can change the base radius to 2.5. That makes the diameter 5 millimeters, which is exactly the height of these. And we are going to change the height because we only want it to pierce from one of these through to the other. So we need it to be just as long as this gap plus this wall. So we're going to change the height. We're going to change the height to 4. So now it is slightly longer than our 2 plus our 1.5 there. And lastly, we're going to zoom way in here so that I can easily see the rotate handle and keep my mouse inside of the circle. When you're working with a very small object, it's almost impossible from a zoomed out view to actually click on the right handle. So we always want to go and zoom in with this fit selection button, and then we can easily use our rotate tool. Remember that if you move your mouse outside the circle, you can rotate to any degree. However, if you accidentally put it at a weird number, we've gone 53, and you click somewhere else, there's no way to get it back if you don't remember exactly how far it went. Let's undo those moves so we're back to straight on the side. And lastly, I don't want to forget to increase the number of sides so this is very smooth because this part is supposed to spin. I've cut the end off here with that top radius so that I don't have to worry about a tiny thin point that might not print properly or break off. So let's zoom out here and line our new pin up with our centerpiece first. So we'll hold down Shift and select the center. We'll go to our Align tool. And I want to make sure that when I move these, I don't move the center since I know it's already in the right place. So I'm going to click on our center cylinder again, and all of the alignment handles are going to line up with the cylinder instead of lining up with the cone. So let's go ahead and zoom out a little so I can see this better. We want it centered on this side since it's facing this way, and we want it to line up with the end here. Now this is actually putting it inside of the cylinder, so it looks bad. I'm going to go ahead and undo that. And we'll move this by hand instead. So now that it's lined up in the center, I'm going to click on an empty space, click on this, and then I can use the arrow keys to move straight to the side without worrying about accidentally moving it up and down. You can always use your arrow keys to move side to side or up and down, and they will move exactly the distance that your grid snap is set to. And right now my grid snap is set to 0.5 millimeters, so I only move half a millimeter each time I move it. By default, it is set to 1. And I'm going to want 0.5 millimeters for my snap here because I need a hole for this that is half a millimeter different from my pin. And we'll see what I mean by that as I zoom in here. So this space now lines up perfectly with the edge of our first ring. And this is a good place to put the hole in our ring. But I want the pin to be half a millimeter away from the hole so that it's not touching. If I cut a hole here and I place the pin in the exact same place, they will be touching the surface. Even though there are two lines there, they'll be so close together that the plastic will join together. So I'm going to use my arrow keys to move this one step back, which is half a millimeter there. And then I'm going to duplicate this. And I'm going to take this duplicate shape that is in the same spot, and I'm going to turn it into a hole. And with that hole, I'm going to push the right arrow key and move it half a millimeter back so I can see the hole right there on the other end. So now if we're very close up, we can see that we have hidden inside the hole, we have our pin, and there's one half a millimeter gap between the two. And now we are going to need another copy of these guys on the opposite side. So since I'm zoomed in really close, I can use my selection box, clicking on an empty space and dragging, to select both of these shapes, the cone and the hole for the cone. And I'll duplicate the both of those. And we will zoom out, go over here to our mirror tool. That changes our handles into our arrows here, and I'm going to mirror it left and right so that I now have a version that is flipped, pointing the other direction. It's a little bit hard to see from this distance, but here we go. Now that I have this mirrored, I'm going to use my middle mouse button to drag my view over towards the other side. I'm going to use my arrow keys to move it all the way over. And since we are moving with a snap on here, we know that we have gone exactly the right number of spaces when we see that cone poking out the other side. So now we have two matching pins that go across. And we need another set facing the other direction. We can't add our pin in the same direction here, or our spin will be going both up and down. So I'm going to take these and rotate them so that they are facing up and down instead of left and right. Let's go ahead and select our other as well by holding down Shift and selecting these two. Now we can see that I have a selection that includes both of these holes and these cones. So I'm going to duplicate them in place, and then we'll use the rotate tool to rotate them 90 degrees. Now I have some pins facing up and down. We're almost there. So I just need to select these guys and move them out to make the same shape, but in between the gap between our two rings instead of our center and our first ring. So I'm going to select just these two. And I've been carefully dragging a selection box that just touches the two shapes. This can be very difficult with a mouse or with a touch screen. So one way that you can make it easier to select small things that you're trying to move around is you can lock down the things you don't want to move. So if I select all of my orange shapes here that I want to stay in place, I can click on the lock here. And now they're highlighted in purple, and you can see I don't have any controls, so I can't move them, I can't group them, I can't do anything. Now, if I just drag a box and select this whole thing, you can see I can use my arrow keys to move my cone, but all of my locked shapes don't move at all. Now I've got the same trick here where I have my hole just poking out of the outside, so I know they're in the right place. We're going to do the same thing with my bottom cone here. We'll select it, use our arrow keys to move it out until it lines up with the outside here. Now we have all of the pins in place. So we have our central disc and our two outer rings. But now we're going to need to select things and group them together to cut those holes. So I'm going to need to select all of my locked objects, click on this unlock here, and now I can edit them again. So let's start from the outside in. Here is where it is tricky. We have a hole that is entirely covering the actual solid piece. So we need to cut the hole first, but we can't select multiple objects and group them because those holes will also remove those pins. So let's click on just the hole shape, make sure that we have it. We can hold down Shift to select our outer ring and just group them together. We're going to do our groups slowly, one at a time, to make sure that we cut the holes out of the correct surfaces. Everything looks good with that. We'll go over here and try and select this hole as well. You can see that I clicked on this shape and I actually selected the solid instead of the hole. Let's zoom in a bit and try and select only the hole without the solid. There we go. Now hold down Shift and click on that outer ring again, and we'll group it together. Now we can see that we've made a hole here. We still have our purple cone in place. So far, so good. Zoom out here, and let's cut our other holes. So I'm going to zoom into this ring a little bit, see if I can select the hole. I've got the hole selected. Hold down Shift, select the ring, and group it. One more time. This time I got the solid. Let's zoom way in here. Now we should easily be able to click on a pixel that is the hole and not the solid. Hold down Shift, select that ring, group them. Now we have the holes for our pins cut, and we can see that the pins, while they're very close, are not touching this shape, which means when we print them, there's going to be enough of a gap here that we can spin them around. Now we can zoom out and we can group everything together. At this point, I could make these separate objects, grouping the cones to the center and so on and so forth, but I don't need to. Since the cones don't touch, I can select everything here and just hit group. We have a single object. So if I were to rotate it around, it would still remain in this position. Unlike my example, in which I rotated them all separately. In order to do this, you would have to group each object with its cones by itself. But this is unnecessary unless you want to show this rotated version. Let's undo that. Oops. There we go. So my example isn't broken anymore. And let's put some finishing touches. We'll put some kind of a design on our central disk here. I'm just going to make this happy face out of some roofs. Get creative with adding holes here. If you add something that is sticking out of the surface of the coin, make sure it doesn't stick up very far. This central shape, if it sticks up too far, will hit the inside of our ring and make it unable to spin. So holes are a safe bet. Let's turn these into holes. We'll rotate this guy around, use him as a smile, and this is looking like a jack-o'-lantern eye here. We will duplicate our eye, move it over to the side. Let's zoom in a bit and see. I think I should make my shapes a little bit smaller. There we go. Now I can group all my holes, and we've got some details. We are ready to print this. As soon as it comes off of the printer, it'll be able to spin. And we are going to set up our multi-part print-in-place spinner to print. So let's take a look at the export. Make sure that we have the object selected. Since I have several other things in here, I only want the selected shape. We'll choose STL. Now we have our STL file. Head over to our slicer, which is Cura. Make sure that we have our printer set up and the correct plastic that we are using so that we are melting it at the right temperature. Let's open up the STL and let's double check that it has lying on the ground here. So all of the surfaces on the underside are red, and usually anything that touches the floor will be highlighted in blue, but I have seen that sometimes this doesn't work quite as intended. Let's take a look and make sure there's nothing that sticks out from below. Looks like I have a problem. So we zoom in here. I find that the cone shapes I have set up here are sticking out slightly below the bottom surface, which means that if I slice it, we're going to end up with a bottom layer that has just the tips of the cones on it. And layer 2 is going to be this, but it's all going to be one layer above the surface of the printer, which means that it's not going to stick at all. So we should always double check we don't have issues like this in our files. If I had simply printed it without checking, I would end up with a mess and I'd have to go back and fix it again. So let's return to Tinkercad and see what we would need to do to fix this. If I look at it from the front, turn on our perspective view, and let's zoom in here, we can see that these cones are sticking out the bottom. Now, this is quite unfortunate since we've used these cones to make our holes. So because I did not drop them onto the floor when I built this first time, I have to rebuild this entirely. So let's try and ungroup our shapes until we have our holes and our cones back again. We have to keep on ungrouping everything until there's no more groups left. Now I can see that my cone and the hole stick out the bottom just a little bit. Now I'm going to quickly go through and move all of the shapes into the right position. I'm going to select all three of these shapes in the center here. Looks like I've got some of this in the middle. So let's try this again. Just these three shapes. I'm going to lock them in place because I want them to not move. Then I'm going to drag and select everything. We can see that our selection box doesn't count our locked shapes. It ignores them. But we have our holes in the center here, which I actually don't want to move since I want them to cut all the way through. So let's remove them from the selection. When I'm looking at it from the side, I'll hold down Shift and we'll drag a box around, deselecting these objects from our selection. Now I can go ahead, and if we look at it from the side, we'll see what happens. There's no button for this, unfortunately, but I'm going to hit D on the keyboard for drop. That will drop the shapes on the floor so that the bottom edge of our cones sits on the floor. So if I had moved everything up too high, I could hit D and drop them straight down on the floor. Since it's the only move that I needed to make, the last thing that I need to do is recut my holes so that each of the holes in the cones are in the correct thing. Let's go ahead and unlock all of my shapes again. And then we're going to select holes, rings, and groups. Hole, ring, group. Not the solid. Hole, ring, group. Zoom in here so it's easier to select. The hole, the ring, group it. Zoom out. Now that I've got my holes cut, and once again group everything. We'll export our shape. And we'll head back over to Cura. We're going to go back to prepare. We're going to remove our incorrect shape. And we'll take our second download. Double check. We can see now that we have blue on the entire bottom. The downward facing surfaces of the cone are marked in red as if they would need supports. But we don't want to build any supports on here that will cause us to block up these holes. So we want to leave the support off. When we create this, we're going to slice it. Check our preview one more time. And as we head all the way down, we can see that our first layer is going to be stuck to the floor. And as we build our shape halfway through, we can see that we have a hole just a half a millimeter away. This will be enough space so that when it is finished printing, our parts are going to spin around. And these objects are small enough that the tiny overhangs are not going to be so big that they will droop down. So now we are ready to save our G code here and send it to the printer.